Hello everyone and welcome back to our course. In the previous lecture, we set up the layout for our app, and in this lecture, we're going to actually populate our chart with an Altair chart. All right, so inside of my code cell, before I run the server, I'm going to define a function called makeFigure, and I'm going to pass in the x-axis and the y-axis as my arguments. All right, first, I need to create a brush for my figure. For that, I'm going to use the Altair module, and I'm going to use its function selection interval. I also have to define the base, which is going to be altair.chart. So I'm creating here a new chart object, and I have to pass in the data. The data in my case is cars, which is that variable that I created earlier. That contains the Vega data set for cars. This is a sample data set that you can use. Next up, we're going to create a scatter plot. So I'm going to create here a variable scatter, and I'm going to use base.markPoint. And I'll add the function encode. I'm going to encode x to equal the argument x-axis, y to equal the argument y-axis, and the color will be origin n. All right. As well, I'm going to append the function properties, so I can set here the width of my scatter plot. I will do 300, and my height I will do 500. Then my selection is going to equal the brush that I created, that brush variable. All right. And just like that, we have defined this scatter variable. All right, next up, this is going to be a scatter plot of y versus x. So what I'm going to do is create a new chart element out of that scatter. So I'm going to take chart as a variable and use Altair. And I'm going to use hconcat to concatenate my scatter plot, and also a second plot that I'm going to make called my histogram. So let's make that histogram next. I'm going to create this variable histogram, and I'm going to again use base, which is the chart, dot mark bar this time, because a histogram is a form of bar chart, not a form of point chart. I'm going to append the encode function, and I'm going to assign x, which will equal altair.x of horsepower q, and bin is equal to true. Following that, I'm going to set y, which is going to equal count, because a histogram counts the frequencies of values, and the color is going to equal origin n again. Then as well, I'm going to add the transform filter function, and I'm going to use my brush, which is my selection interval, and I'm going to use the ref function. Then onto this histogram, I can also set properties directly onto the histogram like that. For example, I could set the height to equal 500. All right, so that is two slightly different ways of creating two different charts. All right, then we'll have this chart variable, which is going to concatenate or combine the scatter chart and the histogram chart. After that, we have to save the HTML of our chart. So I'm going to create here my cars HTML, and I'm going to use the IO module, which has a string IO class, and I'm going to instantiate that. So I'm creating a new string IO object in memory to save my HTML, because then I can call chart.save. Okay, so I'm taking my Altair chart, and I'm saving the string IO object, cars HTML, as an HTML object. That way I can actually render it in my app, which is for web. Finally, this function is going to return the HTML from the string IO object. So it's going to return cars HTML dot get value. So you can just use this get value function to get the HTML. One more thing we need to add is a callback. So make sure you're above the function makeFigure, okay? And we're going to put in a callback. We open up ampersand app.callback, and this is similar to what we did in the previous project. We have to define the output and input. Okay, so let's start with output. The output is going to be on our plot element. So the plot element, let's just look for it. It's that iframe, okay? So the output is going to take that iframe because it has the ID of plot. Then we're going to grab the source doc. That refers to that HTML element that we created. So this means that we're going to take that cars HTML and we're going to use it to update the iframe. And in that way, we can populate that iframe dynamically. Now, what is the input? What is the input that produces that change on the app? Well, we need an input for the x-axis and for the y-axis. Let's start with x-axis, and it's going to be the value. So the x-axis refers to this drop-down that has the ID of x-axis. So that's what we're referring to here. This means that when the user selects something from that drop-down, it's going to affect the plot. As well, we need to also allow the user to select something from the y-axis and have it affect the plot. So the second line means that if the user is going to change an element or select a new element from the drop-down menu for y-axis, then that is also going to have the ability to affect the output of the plot. Awesome. Okay, now let's run this code cell and we are going to see our elements in action. So if I scroll down here, I'm going to see here, okay, we have x-axis, y-axis, drop-down menus, and look at this. We also now have our two charts, okay? We have our scatter chart and we have our histogram. Okay, they're quite tall, so let me just change their height. I'm going to change the height to 300, just because otherwise they're going to be really tall and I'll have to scroll. The other option is just to remove this mode of inline and just launch the app in a new tab. You can also do that. Okay, great. I made them a bit smaller here, now you can see. So the scatter plot, let's start with that. We can see we have acceleration versus miles per gallon. All right, so we're seeing the relationship between the two features. We could change one of the elements here, such as the x-axis, to cylinders. And look at that. That is going to directly change my scatter plot. So now I'm plotting acceleration versus cylinders. So we can see cylinders is more of a fixed value rather than a range. So therefore, that's why we have this difference, because we have, for example, if a car has 4 cylinders, we see its range of acceleration. Being able to create scatter plots and also histograms like this is really going to allow you to more easily understand your data and also to more easily tell stories from your data. So this is really interesting to look at because you can plot all of your different features against each other. And in that way you can see, what kind of machine learning could I do? Could I do linear regression? Yes, I could if I had these two features. You can also see which of the features are irrelevant. You know, some features might not have any use because they might have a completely random correlation. So therefore, you might not need to use it. Now for this histogram, let's talk about this. We have count of records, and then we have versus horsepower. And we also have different colors depending on different countries. So we have Europe, Japan, and USA. So we can see how many records we have of our cars. So really this is a way of showing the different frequencies. So here we're seeing frequencies of horsepower. So how many times cars had a certain horsepower. So the most frequent horsepower, the most common horsepower, as you can see, was between 80 and 100 because that had the most number of records. And you can also see the whole sample separated by countries as well. Now, this horsepower is binned, so this means that you can see I only have horsepower as my X. But if you wanted to allow user input, you could do that as well to show histograms of different values. So like not just horsepower, but you could show the frequencies of other elements as well. And that is how you can build out your second Dash app with Altair. And look at how quickly we created our second Dash app. That's really going to allow you to bring your data science, your data analysis, and your machine learning work to the web. And it's going to be a great asset for you because you can build a portfolio that you can easily show off to any employer. Awesome. Okay, congratulations everyone on completing another project, and I hope to see you next time. Where you can go from here is you can, as I mentioned, add more histogram types. So you could grab user input to determine the histogram x-axis. You could also just build other chart types because currently we've only built out a scatter chart and a histogram chart, but there are other types of charts that you can build as well. And another challenge to go from here is you can also change the style of your Dash app. So just as you would with CSS to change an HTML page, you can actually style all the content on this page as well. So with Dash, you can build not only HTML components and Dash components, but you can also style them as well. So with Dash, you can build quite complex applications. There's a lot that you could do from here, and I encourage you to take on the challenges I just mentioned. And I will see you in another course.